"I'll make you crave me," the most feared Mafia boss whispered. She couldn't resist him. "I need you pregnant within 6 months, or your father dies screaming." Those words hung in the tobacco-scented air of an abandoned warehouse like a death sentence. Wren Castellan's wrist burned against zip ties as industrial lights flickered overhead, casting shadows across the face of the man who had just bought her entire future. Damian Volkov, silver-haired, carved from 3 decades of violence, the most feared name in Chicago's underworld, didn't blink as he laid out his terms. 1 year, 1 child, 1 impossible choice. But here's the thing about cages. Sometimes the lock is on the inside. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments, because you are not ready for how this contract twists everyone involved. Like, share, notifications on. This story is going to leave you speechless. Wren's first mistake that night was answering her door at 3 in the morning. Her second was believing she still had a choice after she opened it. She'd been dreaming, one of those weightless, formless dreams that evaporate the moment consciousness creeps back in, when the pounding started. Not a knock, a demand. The kind of sound that said, "We're coming in whether you open this or not." Her apartment in Lincoln Park wasn't much. A 4th-floor walk-up with temperamental heating and a landlord who treated maintenance requests like optional suggestions. But it was hers. She'd scraped together the deposit working double shifts, painted the bedroom walls herself in a shade called museum linen that cost $43 a gallon. She'd built something here, something safe. The pounding came again, harder. She stumbled out of bed, an oversized university sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, dark hair a wild tangle around her face. Through the peephole she saw 2 men in dark suits. Not police. Worse. Wren Castellan. The taller one's voice was flat, professional. "Open the door. We're not here to hurt you." Yet, her brain supplied helpfully. "I'm calling the police." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. "Your father's debt was called in 3 hours ago. We're here on behalf of Mr. Volkov. You can come with us now, or we can come back with more convincing methods. Your choice." Her father. Of course it was her father. Thomas Castellan, charming, reckless, perpetually optimistic Thomas Castellan, had a gift for exactly 2 things: finding trouble and leaving his daughter to clean up the mess. She'd bailed him out before, covered his rent when he gambled away his disability check, paid off loan sharks who came sniffing around his studio apartment. But this sounded different. "I don't have any money." "We're not here for money, Miss Castellan. We're here for you." The taller man produced a phone, tapped something, and held it up to the peephole. Grainy video, clear enough. Her father tied to a chair in what looked like a basement, blood crusted around his nose, one eye swollen shut. A timestamp in the corner, 16 minutes ago. He's alive. How long he stays that way depends on how cooperative you are in the next 30 seconds. Wren's hands shook as she unlocked the deadbolt, the chain, the handle lock she'd installed herself after a break-in 2 floors down last spring. The door swung open, and the 2 men stepped inside like they owned the place. Maybe they did now. "Get dressed. Something nice. You're meeting the boss." The shorter one had a scar running from his left ear to his collar, and eyes that had stopped registering human suffering somewhere around his first felony. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about." The taller one, she mentally labeled him almost polite, gestured toward her bedroom. "Your father borrowed $2.3 million from Mr. Volkov's organization over the last 18 months. He was supposed to flip a warehouse property in Pilsen, turn it into loft conversions. Instead, he gambled away the construction loan, forged inspection documents, and disappeared for 3 weeks. The property's condemned. Mr. Volkov is displeased. 2.3 million. The number didn't feel real. Too big. Too abstract. Like hearing casualties in a distant war. He can't pay that back. No. But Mr. Volkov is a reasonable man. He's offering an alternative arrangement. What kind of arrangement? The scarred one smiled for the first time. It didn't reach his eyes, the kind you discuss in person. Now get dressed, Miss Castellan. We're on a schedule. They drove in silence through Chicago's sleeping streets, the city a blur of sodium lights and empty intersections. Wren sat in the back of a black Mercedes SUV, hands clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. She'd thrown on the only thing in her closet that qualified as nice, a charcoal shift dress worn to gallery openings, ankle boots that had seen better days, no jewelry except the thin gold necklace her mother had left her. Something to hold on to. Outside, Chicago transformed from residential neighborhoods to industrial zones, the buildings growing more skeletal, more hostile. They pulled into a warehouse district near the river, the kind of place gentrification hadn't bothered to knock yet. Graffiti-tagged walls, broken streetlights, loading docks that probably moved more than furniture after dark. The SUV stopped in front of a corrugated metal building with no identifying marks, just a number spray-painted on the door. Out. Wren's legs felt like water as she stepped onto the cracked pavement. The March wind cut through her dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself. Almost polite led her to a side entrance, produced a key card, and the door clicked open. Inside was nothing like she expected. The warehouse had been converted into something between a fortress and a gentleman's club. Exposed brick walls, reclaimed wood floors, industrial lighting fixtures that probably cost more than her annual salary, leather furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, a bar salvaged from a Prohibition-era speakeasy, and everywhere, the sense of watching eyes, even though the vast space appeared empty. Wait here. Wren didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room, heart hammering, mind racing through scenarios. Ransom, coercion, indentured servitude. Worse, the elevator at the far end of the space dinged. Wren turned and met the man who would ruin her life. Damian Volkov didn't look like a monster. That was the first thing that struck her. She'd built an image during the drive, brutish, scarred, visibly cruel. Instead, the man stepping out of the elevator wore a three-piece charcoal suit, tailored so precisely it might as well have been armor. Silver hair swept back from a face all sharp angles and cold intelligence. 57, she remembered, but he moved like someone decades younger, each step deliberate and controlled. His eyes, though, those were where the danger lived. Grey as lake ice in February, and just as unforgiving. Miss Castellan. His voice was smoke and old whiskey, carrying an accent that suggested roots buried under decades of American reinvention. Thank you for joining us. As if I had a choice, she thought, but didn't say. Where's my father? Damian crossed to the bar, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. Didn't offer her one. Your father is alive, and in better condition than he deserves, considering his recent behavior. Would you like to see him? I want to know what you want from me. His smile was the kind that probably made most people tell him everything he wanted to hear. Direct. I appreciate that. Most people waste my time with pleading or threats. You've done neither. I'm sure you'll give me a reason to plead soon enough. His smile widened. Perhaps. Come walk with me. It wasn't a request. Wren followed him toward the elevator, her boots clicking against the wood floor. Up close, she could see the details distance had hidden. A thin scar along his jaw, faint burns along the knuckles of his left hand, silver cufflinks engraved with a family crest she didn't recognize. The elevator opened directly into an office built for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river, the city's skyline glittering beyond. A mahogany desk, probably antique, probably worth more than everything Wren owned combined. Behind it hung a painting, The Taking of Christ, her art history degree supplied automatically, a brutal depiction of betrayal rendered in shadow and light. Do you know what I do, Miss Castellan? Damian settled into the leather chair behind his desk, gesturing for her to sit opposite. She remained standing. You hurt people who owe you money. I maintain order in a chaotic world. Your father signed contracts, made promises, took money that wasn't his to lose. In the legitimate business world, he'd file bankruptcy, restructure, leave his creditors holding worthless paper. In my world, debts are settled in full, always. I don't have $2.3 million. No one does, if they're honest. That's the problem with modern debt. It's become abstract. Numbers on a screen. I prefer tangible solutions. He opened a drawer, withdrew a folder, slid it across the desk toward her. Which brings us to my proposal. Wren didn't touch it. I'm not sleeping with you for money. Of course not. You'll be sleeping with me because you're my wife. The words landed like a physical blow. Wren stumbled back a step, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. Excuse me. Damian leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. I need an heir. You need your father to live. These are compatible problems with a single elegant solution. Marry me. Provide me with a child. Remain in the marriage for 1 year, and your father's debt is forgiven. He walks away. You walk away. Everyone lives. You're insane. I'm practical. I've outlived 2 wives, Miss Castellan. I'm 57 years old, and my doctors inform me I have perhaps 4 years remaining, if I'm fortunate. I have built an empire over 3 decades, and without an heir, everything I've built will be torn apart within 6 months of my death. Then, adopt. Find someone who actually wants this. I don't have time for pretense, and I have no interest in a partner who mistakes my wealth for affection. You, however, you're here because you have to be. There's honesty in that. He made it sound so reasonable, so clinical, like they were negotiating a corporate merger instead of a human life. And if I refuse? Damian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Then your father dies slowly, and publicly, as an example, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if there was something you could have done. The threat was delivered in the same calm tone he'd used to discuss his own mortality moments earlier. You're a monster, yes, but I'm a monster offering you a choice. Most people in your position don't get that luxury. The folder sat on the desk between them like a loaded gun. Wren stared at it for a long moment, then reached out with shaking hands and flipped it open. A contract. Medical records, financial statements, photographs. The first showing her father, cleaned up, bandaged but alive in a hospital room. He's being cared for. I don't damage assets unnecessarily. Assets. As if her father were a piece of equipment. She forced herself to read the contract. 12 months from date of marriage, conception and delivery of 1 healthy child, DNA testing to confirm paternity, shared residence. Public appearance of a legitimate marriage, $10 million upon completion, full custody negotiation rights, complete release from her father's debt. You've done this before. I've learned to protect my interests. The contract is fair, Miss Castellan. Harsh, but fair. Fair would be letting my father face his own consequences, perhaps, but you're here, which suggests you disagree with that assessment. Damian stood, moved to the windows overlooking the city. With his back to her, he looked almost human. Almost. I won't pretend this is anything other than what it is. A transaction. But I'll make you 2 promises. First, I won't force myself on you. Conception happens on your terms, your timeline. Second, I will keep you safe. From the moment you sign until the moment you walk away, you have my complete protection. In my world, that's worth more than love. Wren wanted to throw the contract in his face, tell him to go to hell, but buried under the rage was a terrible, pragmatic truth. She had no other way. I need time. You have 30 seconds. After that, my men take your father somewhere you'll never find him, and we proceed with a more traditional collection process. That's not time. That's a gun to my head. Yes, it is. She looked down at the contract, at the photographs, at the coldly elegant signature line waiting for her name. She thought about her mother, dead when Wren was 13, about her father, who loved her and couldn't stop destroying himself. about the small, safe life she'd built with her own 2 hands. I want to see him first, before I sign. Damian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Take Miss Castellan to the medical suite. 5 minutes. Her father looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since she'd last seen him. Thomas Castellan sat on the edge of a hospital bed, monitors humming, an IV stand beside him. Wren. Baby, I'm so sorry. How could you be so reckless? $2.3 million, Dad. I was thinking I could finally give you something. That property was supposed to be our future. I don't paint anymore, and I like my job. Her father's eyes filled with tears. Whatever he's asking you to do, say no. I'm not worth it. And there it was. The truth they'd both been dancing around since her mother's funeral. He wasn't worth it, but he was all she had. I love you, Dad. Even when I hate you for putting me in this position, I love you. So I'm going to do something incredibly stupid, and you're going to live with it. Wren, no. She was already turning, already walking back toward the elevator. Take me back to Mr. Volkov. I'm ready to sign. The fountain pen felt too heavy in her hand. The signature ink hadn't fully dried before Damian's phone lit up on the mahogany desk. An encrypted message. Unknown internal number. His expression shifted for exactly 1 second, the first crack Wren had seen in his composure all night, before he flattened it back into nothing. He didn't explain. He simply closed the folder over her signature and set the pen down with the same precision he brought to everything. The wedding happened 11 days later. Small, private, entirely transactional. Wren stood in a dress Damian's staff had selected without consulting her. Ivory silk, structured, nothing about it soft, in front of a justice of the peace who'd clearly been compensated well enough to ask no questions about the bride's total lack of guests beyond one heavily armed groomsman and a photographer who never once smiled. She signed the marriage certificate with the same fountain pen from the warehouse. Damian's hand didn't shake when he signed his own name beside hers. Hers did. The mansion on the Gold Coast swallowed her whole the moment she stepped through its doors. More security than most government buildings. Cameras in every hallway corner. Men in dark suits, stationed at intervals she couldn't quite predict. A perimeter fence that hummed faintly with current. Staff addressed her as Mrs. Volkov with unreadable professional courtesy, the kind that revealed nothing about what they actually thought of the situation. Her bedroom suite adjoined Damian's through a locked door. Neither of them had touched since her arrival. He'd kept his promise from the warehouse with the same cold precision he brought to everything else. No pressure, no demands. A careful distance that read simultaneously as respect, and as its own kind of wall neither of them had figured out how to dismantle yet. Wren spent her first week cataloging. It was instinct more than strategy. The same forensic attention she'd once used identifying forged provenance on damaged canvases now turned on an entirely different kind of authentication problem. The specific tension in certain staff members whenever Nikolai Petrov's name came up. The way Damian's oldest ally watched her during their one formal introduction, with an attention that didn't quite match his warm, avuncular public demeanor. She couldn't name the unease yet, but she'd learned a long time ago never to ignore it. Carlos Reyes, almost polite from that first night, became her only real anchor inside the house. He never softened his professional distance completely, but something in his sharp assessment of her shifted within the first 2 weeks, a grudging recalibration she caught in small moments. "You don't flinch much," he observed one evening, watching her walk the mansion's grounds without an escort for the first time. Flinching doesn't fix anything. Something that might have been respect flickered across his face before he fell back into professional silence. Dinner with Damian became, unexpectedly, the closest thing to normal in her new life. Not romantic, not even particularly warm, but structured, predictable, a nightly hour where he discussed the empire he'd built with something approaching real passion, instead of the clinical necessity that had defined the warehouse. 35 years, he said one evening, swirling wine he barely drank. Started with nothing but my father's debts and a willingness to do things other men wouldn't. Built legitimate businesses on top of the foundation nobody was supposed to look at too closely. Real estate, shipping, investment portfolios that outperform half the funds on Wall Street. You built an empire to hide an empire. Something flickered across his face. Not quite surprise, closer to genuine reassessment. Nobody's ever put it that way before. Most people are too afraid of you to say anything interesting. You're not afraid of me. I'm terrified of you. I'm just tired of pretending that means I have nothing left to say. The ghost of something almost like amusement crossed his mouth before he caught it and smoothed it away. 3 weeks into the marriage, Wren noticed the Caravaggio. Not the one in his office. A different one, smaller, hanging in the mansion's private East Wing gallery, tucked between 2 windows where the light hit it at an angle that made the brushwork visible in a way most people would never bother examining. She studied it for nearly 10 minutes before she said anything. This is a forgery. Damian, standing in the doorway watching her without her noticing, went completely still. Excuse me? The brushstroke consistency in the shadow work doesn't match his documented technique from this period, and the crequelure pattern is too uniform. Real age cracking is irregular. This was artificially distressed. She traced a finger an inch above the canvas, careful never to touch it. Someone sold you a very good copy for what I'm guessing was an obscene amount of money. Damian crossed the room slowly, studying the painting with new eyes. I paid $4 million for this piece 11 years ago, authenticated by 3 separate experts. Then you were robbed by 4 people, not 3. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Then, quietly, something shifted in his expression that Wren hadn't seen from him before. Not calculation, not the careful control he wore like armor. Genuine respect. I'll have it re-examined. You'll find I'm right. I already believe you're right, Mrs. Volkov. That's precisely the problem. He didn't explain what he meant by that. He simply looked at her a moment longer than the conversation required, before turning and leaving the gallery, and Wren stood alone with a $4 million forgery, feeling something in the mansion's careful architecture of distance, quietly, imperceptibly shift. It was nearly 2 weeks later, unable to sleep, restless in the specific way the mansion's silence sometimes produced, when Wren wandered the East Wing past midnight. She wasn't looking for anything. She found it anyway. Nikolai Petrov's voice carried faintly from a study she'd never seen him use before. The door cracked open just enough to let words through, low, rapid, in a language she didn't fully understand, though she'd picked up enough fragments during her weeks in the house to catch certain patterns. She slowed, stopped entirely, pressing herself against the hallway wall in the specific stillness she'd learned as a child, listening for the sound of her father's key in the lock, trying to gauge from the rhythm of his footsteps exactly how much trouble had followed him home. Nikolai's voice dropped lower. Then, unmistakably, in clear English, a name that made every cell in Wren's body go cold. Thomas Castellan, her father's name, spoken with a familiarity that made absolutely no sense. Nikolai wasn't supposed to know her father existed beyond the basic facts of the debt. He certainly wasn't supposed to be discussing him on a private call, in a locked study, at 1 a.m, in a tone that carried none of the distant procedural coldness of a man discussing a stranger's unpaid obligations. It was the tone of someone discussing an asset they'd personally deployed. Wren didn't move, didn't breathe. The conversation continued for another 30 seconds, words she couldn't fully catch, tone she understood completely, before Nikolai's footsteps crossed toward the door. She was 3 hallways away before he emerged, moving with the specific silent efficiency she'd spent 4 years perfecting inside her father's chaos, every instinct screaming the same devastating conclusion. Her father's debt, the warehouse deal that collapsed into federal condemnation, the forged inspection documents her father had supposedly created himself, alone, in his own careless desperation. None of it added up the way it was supposed to. Back in her room, Door locked. Wren sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, replaying every detail of that single overheard sentence, feeling the entire architecture of her forced marriage shift beneath her like ground giving way. Damian believed her father had gambled his way into an unpayable debt through his own recklessness. Wren had believed it too, every furious, heartbroken word of it, standing in that medical suite watching her father cry. But Nikolai Petrov, Damian's oldest ally, the man everyone in this house treated with automatic, unquestioning trust, had just spoken her father's name like he'd known it far longer, and far more intimately, than any outside creditor ever should. Wren didn't sleep at all that night. She sat awake in the dark, running the same forensic instinct she'd once used on damaged canvases, applying it now to something considerably more dangerous than authenticating a painting. Someone inside this house had orchestrated more than a debt, and she had absolutely no idea yet exactly how deep it went, or how much danger she'd just accidentally stepped into by simply being unable to sleep on an ordinary Tuesday night. Wren didn't confront Nikolai directly. 4 years of managing her father's chaos had taught her exactly one unbreakable rule: confrontation without proof was the fastest way to lose everything before you'd even started fighting for it. Instead, she watched. She applied the same forensic patience she'd once used on damaged canvases to the specific, accumulating inconsistencies gathering around Nikolai Petrov's behavior, the way his schedule tightened noticeably whenever household audits were scheduled, the specific staff members who suddenly found excuses to be elsewhere when his name came up in casual conversation, the careful distance he maintained from certain financial documents Damian trusted him to oversee without oversight of his own. Her opening came 10 days later. During a household financial review, Damian invited her to observe, a courtesy extended, she suspected, more out of the growing habit of trusting her instincts than any genuine expectation she'd find anything useful. She found everything useful. The original figures on her father's debt didn't fully reconcile against the construction loan documentation she managed to glimpse during the review. Inflated numbers in places that made no operational sense. A loan, structured from its very origin, with terms that guaranteed collapse rather than success. The kind of engineering that took financial sophistication her father had never once demonstrated in his life. And the inspection documents, forged with a precision that suggested professional expertise, not the clumsy, desperate improvisation of a man in over his head trying to cover his own mistakes. Her father hadn't orchestrated his own downfall. Someone had orchestrated it for him. Wren's suspicion crystallized into something closer to certainty 3 weeks later, at a charity gala Damian's organization sponsored, one of the rare public events where Mrs. Volkov was expected to appear, polished and unreadable, on her husband's arm. A woman approached her near the bar, introducing herself as Elena Marsh, with the careful, deliberate ease of someone who'd chosen the moment precisely. "You're not what I expected." Elena's smile stayed pleasant, professional, giving nothing away to anyone watching from across the room. "What did you expect?" Someone less observant. "Your husband doesn't usually make mistakes with who he lets close to him. You might be the exception." Something in the phrasing made Wren's instincts sharpen immediately. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching your husband's organization for longer than you've been married to him." Someone who noticed a specific financial irregularity, feeding intelligence to 3 rival families over the past year, and someone who's starting to wonder if the source of that leak is a lot closer to Damian Volkov than he'd ever want to believe. Elena's eyes held hers a beat too long. "I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Volkov, but I'd be very careful about who you trust inside that house right now." She was gone before Wren could ask another question, disappearing into the crowd with the specific practiced efficiency of someone used to controlling exactly how much information she revealed and when. Wren spent the rest of the gala running the conversation on a continuous loop, every careful word landing with new weight against everything she'd already suspected about Nikolai. Federal law enforcement had been watching Damian's organization. an active intelligence leak, feeding 3 rival families for over a year. It fit too precisely against her father's engineered debt to be coincidence. She brought it to Damian directly 2 nights later. Not accusations, evidence, laid out on his desk with the same precise clarity she'd once used authenticating a disputed painting, every inconsistency documented, every timeline cross-referenced, the financial irregularities from the household audit placed beside her, overheard fragment of Nikolai speaking her father's name with an intimacy that made no sense for a stranger. Damian read through it in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Wren watched something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not the controlled calculation he brought to everything, but the specific, devastating recalibration of 30 years of trust, colliding with mounting, undeniable proof. He's been with me since I was 26 years old. His voice came out quieter than she'd ever heard it. I trusted him with my father's funeral arrangements. I trusted him with both of my wives' deaths. I trusted him with everything I built. I know this is. You didn't do anything wrong by bringing this to me. He cut her off, and for the first time since the warehouse, something in his grey eyes wasn't cold at all. You did exactly what you should have done. The failure here isn't yours, it's mine, for never once questioning the one blind spot loyalty always creates in men who think they're too careful to have one. The realization settled between them with weight neither of them had expected to carry together. Your father's debt was never really about your father. Damian's voice hardened, calculation returning, sharpened now by fury he was visibly working to control. It was never about the money at all. It was about finding a way to get someone with no existing loyalties, no protection, no connection to anyone in this organization, directly into my house. Someone he could control, or eliminate, once she'd served whatever purpose he needed her for. He looked at her fully then, and Wren saw something shift completely in how he was looking at her. You were never a solution to my problem, Wren. You were his weapon aimed at both of us. Something in the room changed after that conversation. 2 strangers bound by contract became, in the space of a single devastating discovery, 2 people who'd just realized they were both targets of the same conspiracy, working together now with genuine partnership, instead of the careful, clinical distance that had defined every interaction between them since the warehouse. Damian began including her in security briefings he'd never once considered sharing with anyone outside his most trusted inner circle. Wren began cross-referencing financial records with the same forensic precision she'd once given canvases, finding threads that connected further and further back, years, not months, of careful, patient betrayal building toward exactly this moment. They worked in his office past midnight most nights now, the locked door between their bedrooms feeling less like a wall and more like a formality neither of them fully believed in anymore. Nikolai noticed the shift. He was too experienced, too carefully attuned to the specific rhythms of the house he'd spent decades embedding himself inside, not to notice Wren's sudden absence from casual conversation, the new locked-door meetings between Damian and his wife that excluded him for the first time in 30 years, the specific quality of watchfulness in Wren's eyes whenever his name came up now. He moved faster than either of them expected. Wren returned from the gallery on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, one of the rare outings Damian's security still permitted, a small tether to the life she'd had before all of this, and drove past her old building on Lincoln Park out of habit, the 4th-floor walk-up she'd never officially given up. Something made her stop. The front door to the building stood slightly ajar, the lock mechanism visibly forced. She climbed the 4 flights with her heart hammering, every instinct screaming the same warning that had once told her to check a peephole at 3 in the morning and change her entire life forever. Her apartment had been ransacked, furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, a specific violation of a space that had once been entirely, safely hers, now stripped of any sense of security at all. And on the bathroom mirror, written in her own lipstick, dragged across the glass in letters that made her blood run cold, "You should have stayed out of this." Damian's response to the threat was immediate and absolute. Full lockdown of the mansion within the hour. Carlos Reyes personally overseeing every layer of Wren's security. The specific, terrifying clarity of watching a man who'd built an empire on controlled violence finally unleash it without restraint, in defense of someone who was never supposed to matter this much to him. I want Nikolai found. Damian's voice carried none of the calm calculation Wren had grown used to over the past weeks. This was something else entirely. Cold, absolute, devastating in its total lack of hesitation, not questioned, found. Nikolai understood his exposure the moment his men reported back that the apartment intrusion had been discovered. He accelerated everything. Within 36 hours, he'd reached out to the 3 rival families he'd been secretly feeding intelligence to for over a year, proposing a coordinated strike against Damian's organization, while it remained destabilized by internal suspicion, offering Wren herself as the specific leverage that would break Damian completely if the rival families were willing to take her alive. Elena Marsh's federal investigation converged with the crisis at exactly the right moment. Her surveillance on Nikolai's outside contacts had been building for months, and the sudden spike in encrypted communication between his known number and 3 separate rival organizations gave her team the specific location and timing of the coordinated strike before it happened. She reached out to Damian directly for the first time in their parallel, unspoken standoff. I don't like you. I don't like your organization, and I've spent 2 years building a case against half of what you've built. Her voice carried none of the gala's careful pleasantness. But I like what Nikolai Petrov is planning even less. He's about to hand your wife to 3 families that will use her as leverage against everyone, including federal law enforcement's own ongoing operations. That makes us allies for the next 48 hours, whether either of us likes it. A fragile, unlikely alliance formed. A Mafia Don's organization and federal law enforcement working from the same intelligence, moving toward the same target, for the first time in either institution's history, choosing cooperation over the war they'd normally wage against each other. Wren refused to be sidelined. I'm not sitting in a locked room while other people fight a war that exists because of my father, and now because of me. Her voice carried the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had defined her entire life. I found the discrepancies. I'm the one who can walk into that confrontation with documentation that leaves Nikolai with no possible defense. You need me there. Damian studied her for a long moment, something warring behind his controlled expression. If anything happens to you, then it happens because I chose to be there. Not because someone else decided I was too fragile to fight for my own life. He didn't argue further. The confrontation unfolded at the warehouse where Wren's entire story had begun. The same corrugated metal building, the same industrial lighting, the same number spray-painted on the door that had once represented the end of her old life. Nikolai stood cornered by Damian's men and Elena's federal team simultaneously, his decades of careful loyalty finally, publicly revealed as nothing but performance. 30 years. Damian's voice carried a devastation that cut deeper than any threat he'd delivered in the story so far. 30 years of trust, Nikolai. My father's funeral. Both my wives' deaths. Every decision I made, you were standing beside me. And the entire time you were building this. Nikolai's composure cracked completely. Decades of careful performance finally collapsing under the specific weight of undeniable proof. You were dying, Damian. Everyone could see it. I watched 3 families circle you like vultures for years, waiting for you to finally fall, and I decided I wasn't going to let strangers pick apart everything we built. I was protecting this organization. You were protecting yourself. Wren stepped forward, the financial documentation in her hands, every discrepancy catalogued with the same forensic precision she'd once brought to authenticating disputed art. You engineered my father's debt. You manufactured a crisis specifically to bring someone with no protection directly into this house, someone you thought you could control or eliminate once she'd served her purpose. That's not protecting an organization. That's building your own empire on top of the one you were supposed to be loyal to. The capos who'd followed Nikolai for years watched his loyalty evaporate in real time, decades of respect curdling into something closer to disgust, as the full scope of his betrayal became undeniable in front of them. Elena's federal team moved simultaneously on the financial evidence that would unravel the rival family's involvement through legitimate channels, arrests executed with the specific precision of an operation 2 years in the making, finally reaching its conclusion. Damian's reckoning with Nikolai carried the full weight of 30 years of friendship curdled into absolute betrayal. It was brutal, and it was final, in exactly the way the world Wren had married into, always demanded when loyalty broke this completely. She didn't watch that part. She stood outside the warehouse in the March wind, exactly where she'd stood that first terrifying night, and let Elena's team lead her to a car while Damian finished what needed finishing inside. Weeks passed. Thomas Castellan's debt was fully erased, his own guilt over his daughter's sacrifice finally given somewhere productive to go, as he began genuine recovery, not just from the specific crisis Nikolai had engineered, but from years of patterns Wren had spent her whole life covering for. "I'm proud of you," he told her one afternoon, visiting the mansion for the first time since everything had settled. "Not because of any of this, because you never once let any of it break you." The immediate danger resolved, Wren and Damian found themselves sitting together in the mansion's east wing on an ordinary evening, not strangers bound by contract anymore, but two people who'd chosen, in the crucible of genuine danger, to actually see each other. "I entered this arrangement, expecting a transaction." Damian's voice carried none of the controlled distance from their first weeks together. "I calculated every possible outcome before I ever met you. What I never once accounted for was this." He gestured between them, something unguarded in his expression that 35 years of armor had never once allowed before. "Genuine feeling terrifies me more than any rival family ever has." Wren studied him for a long moment, the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had defined her entire life settling into something warmer now. "I signed a contract to save my father." Her voice stayed steady, sure. "And somehow I ended up finding a partner instead. The irony of falling for the monster who bought me isn't lost on me." Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile crossed Damian's face. "I stopped being that monster somewhere in the last several months. I'm not entirely certain when. Neither am I." She reached across the space between them, and this time neither of them thought of it as a transaction at all. The 6-month conception clause sat quietly, mutually abandoned as a deadline in the weeks that followed, reframed instead as something neither of them needed to force, because whatever was growing between them now belonged entirely to choice, not contract. If this story kept you on the edge from that first pounding at her door to this final quiet evening, if it reminded you that even the coldest arrangements can become something neither person saw coming, subscribe right now because we are not finished. Share this with someone who loves a slow burn worth waiting for. Like this video, drop your city below, and turn on notifications.